Genesis 34 to 35. Matthew 11. In response, Dinah's brothers, Simeon and Levi, deceive the men of Shechem and kill them, taking their sister back. Genesis 35. Jacob returns to Bethel, where God reaffirms his covenant with him. Rachel dies giving birth to Benjamin, and Isaac, Jacob's father, also passes away. Matthew 11. Jesus also denounces the unrepentant cities and extends an invitation to all who are weary and burdened, promising them rest. Genesis 36 to 37. Genesis. This chapter provides a genealogy of Esau, who is also called Edom. It lists his descendants, the chiefs of Edom, and the kings who reigned in Edom before any Israelite king reigned. Genesis 37. This chapter begins the story of Joseph, one of Jacob's sons. Joseph is favored by his father, which causes jealousy among his brothers. They plot against him, eventually selling him into slavery in Egypt. Joseph's journey to Egypt sets the stage for significant events in the later chapters. Genesis 38 to 40. Matthew 12. Genesis 38 to 40. Genesis 38. This chapter tells the story of Judah and Tamar. Tamar, Judah's daughter-in-law, disguises herself as a prostitute to seduce Judah and ensure her lineage. She becomes pregnant and later reveals her identity, leading Judah to acknowledge his wrongdoing. Genesis 39. This chapter focuses on Joseph in Egypt. Joseph is sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. Despite being falsely accused by Potiphar's wife and imprisoned, Joseph remains faithful to God and gains favor in the prison. Genesis 40. While in prison, Joseph interprets the dreams of Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker. The cupbearer's dream foretells his restoration to his position, while the baker's dream predicts his execution. Joseph's interpretations come true, but the cupbearer forgets to mention Joseph to Pharaoh. Matthew 12. He performs miracles, including healing a man with a withered hand and casting out demons. Jesus also speaks about the sign of Jonah, the unpardonable sin, and the importance of doing the will of God. Genesis 41. This chapter tells the story of Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams. Pharaoh has two troubling dreams that none of his wise men can interpret. The cupbearer, who had previously been in prison with Joseph, remembers Joseph's ability to interpret dreams and recommends him to Pharaoh. Joseph interprets the dreams as a warning of 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of severe famine. Impressed by Joseph's wisdom, Pharaoh appoints him as the second in command over Egypt to oversee the storage of surplus grain during the years of abundance. When the famine arrives, Egypt is well prepared, and people from surrounding lands come to Egypt to buy grain. Genesis 42. This chapter describes how Joseph's brothers travel to Egypt to buy grain during the famine. They do not recognize Joseph, who is now the governor of Egypt. Joseph accuses them of being spies and imprisons them for 3 days. He then releases them, keeping Simeon as a hostage, and sends the rest back to Canaan with grain, instructing them to return with their youngest brother, Benjamin. Genesis 43. In this chapter, the famine continues, and Jacob's family runs out of grain. Reluctantly, Jacob allows his sons to return to Egypt with Benjamin. When they arrive, Joseph invites them to a meal at his house. The brothers are puzzled by the special treatment and the return of their money in their sacks. Joseph is moved when he sees Benjamin but keeps his identity hidden. Genesis 44 to 45. Matthew 13. Genesis 44 to 45. Genesis 44. Joseph tests his brothers by placing his silver cup in Benjamin's sack and accusing them of theft. When the cup is found, Judah pleads for Benjamin's release, offering himself as a substitute. This act of self-sacrifice moves Joseph deeply. Genesis 45. Joseph reveals his identity to his brothers and forgives them for selling him into slavery. He explains that it was part of God's plan to save their family from the famine. Joseph invites his entire family to live in Egypt, and Pharaoh provides them with the best land in Goshen. Matthew 13. This chapter contains several parables that Jesus uses to teach about the kingdom of heaven. These include the parable of the sower, the parable of the weeds, the parable of the mustard seed, the parable of the yeast, the parable of the hidden treasure, the parable of the pearl, and the parable of the net. Jesus explains the meaning of some of these parables to his disciples, emphasizing the importance of understanding and accepting his teachings. Genesis 46. This chapter describes Jacob's journey to Egypt with his entire family. God reassures Jacob in a vision, promising to make him a great nation in Egypt. Jacob and his family, totaling 70 people, travel to Egypt. Joseph and Jacob have an emotional reunion. Joseph instructs his family on how to present themselves to Pharaoh, emphasizing their occupation as shepherds. Genesis 47. In this chapter, Joseph presents his family to Pharaoh, who grants them the best land in Goshen. The famine continues, and Joseph manages the distribution of grain, eventually acquiring all the land and livestock for Pharaoh in exchange for food. The Israelites settle in Goshen and prosper. Jacob, nearing the end of his life, makes Joseph promise to bury him in Canaan.